So now we are going to move into our first workshop. This workshop is on our discipline policy revisions. And I am going to hand it over to the superintendent to get us started.
Just briefly, as part of the district's equity work, we're committed to reviewing current policies that create unintended barriers to access. Our school discipline data has shown historically an overrepresentation of students of color and students who are low income and who have special needs in our discipline outcomes. To initiate this discipline policy review process, the Center for Educational Equity conducted an equity audit of our policies with a focus on our discipline-related policies. And based on that feedback, we revised them to align with our work in schools to reduce these disparities. Tonight, Assistant Superintendent Erin Townsend will be walking you through the work that the policy committee has been engaged in for the past few months to create a set of coherent policies grounded in principles of equity and restorative practices. I would like to thank Erin and Jake Giesman, who is with us for this, and he's been a key leader and model in both his practice as an assistant principal and in volunteering to help manage this process with Erin. So, Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Superintendent. I'll walk us through a few of the slides here for our presentation, but it's exciting to be bringing this work forward this evening for the board's consideration. This has been a body of work that really has been underway almost since even prior to my joining the district. So almost over 2 years since the policies were initially shared with the Center for Educational Equity. So excited to be at this point for consideration. Our goals for, and again, huge shout out to Jake Giesman for his support, knowledge, all of the time and effort he spent to help bring this work to where it stands today. So look forward to giving him some space to share some of the details about where we stand with these policies. But our goals tonight are the first one I'll kind of own, which is shared understanding of the rationale and process for the revisions. And then Jake will walk us through what are some of the substantive changes to each of the discipline policies that the policy committee has reviewed and kind of voted to move forward for the full board's consideration. So as the superintendent indicated, it has become well documented in national research that there is significant disproportionality in school discipline outcomes, amongst based on a number of different subgroups. A recent American Psychological Association research brief framed, as it says here, that Black, Hispanic, and Native American students were 2 to 5 times as likely as white and Asian students to be suspended or expelled. And these exclusionary discipline practices lead to significant negative outcomes for those students over time. In one study of over 1 million students, even one incident of suspension or expulsion led to a student being 3 times more likely to be engaged in the juvenile justice system in the following year. So it's a critical issue that has been well documented in the national research. And as the superintendent named, these are issues that we face here as well. This is a chart regarding the out-of-school suspensions in school year 2019-2020 for Portland Public Schools. And as it shows here, we have a number of areas where there is some to significant disproportionality in terms of the percent of the student population and the percent of out-of-school suspensions that they receive. So as you'll see in this graph, our Black, our African-American students, our students who are multiracial have some significant disproportionality in the rates of suspension for those students. And then even more significantly, some of the programmatic subgroups are students who are economically disadvantaged, or students who are English learners, or students who are receive special education services. We have some significant work to do to reduce that level of disproportionality. However, while these challenges do exist, there are some evidence-based solutions to bring forward to begin to mitigate for these issues and these disparities. The first, holistically, is to begin to focus on relationships. We know connection and belonging is one of the strongest measures we can take to be able to establish a student's kind of relationship at school and make them feel connected. Additionally, in our broader work around teaching and learning, providing all students with equal access to high quality instruction is a significant intervention to be able to reduce this disproportionality. Meaningful engagement for students that's relevant to them, reflects their experiences, and challenges them is, again, one of the strongest strategies we can have in play to reduce the disparities that we see in our discipline data. Then last, in terms of strategies around school culture management, there is significant research around the support for the development of multi-tiered systems of support, specifically the implementation of positive PBIS, the positive behavioral interventions and supports, and the development of restorative justice and restorative practices within schools that make the pivot away from exclusionary disciplinary practices to ones around learning, development, and community development for these actions. So this has been work that we have been engaged in as a district for a number of years in terms of building our capacity, and certainly significantly more work to go to be able to have the impact we want to see. But as the superintendent named, as part of our charge and equity goal is looking at our policies and practices to ensure that they aren't creating these unintended barriers for students and to bring them into alignment with the vision that we have for student success. So that's what led us to do this work around the discipline policies to ensure that we made the pivot, not just in practice, but in policy to support that work that lays a foundation for building a more equitable and just school district, more equitable and just school communities, and makes this shift away from the exclusionary disciplinary practices kind of the past. So in terms of how we've gone about this work, as I said, this has been really almost a couple years in the making at this point. So through our partnership with the Center for Educational Equity, which has been a partner with us in our equity work and the development of the equity cohorts for a number of years, they did a review of the policies that were in front of you to provide feedback to help advance them to have a more to have a stronger equity lens. Based on the feedback, and that was kind of where we picked up and where Dr. Giesman began his engagement with this work of trying to incorporate those recommendations. We had multiple rounds then of feedback and engagement with the Family Partnership Advisory Committee. As you may remember, there has been a discipline subcommittee as part of that group. So with those folks, in addition to the broader Family Partnership Advisory Committee, we've engaged multiple times over the past year to get their feedback on the draft revisions. Additionally, we've had a couple of engagements with our school leaders and central office leaders to ensure that the language in the policy reflects, the practices that we are seeking to grow and develop across all of our schools, to reduce these disparities. We as well engaged with the Portland Education Association through our collaboration through the Living Contract Committee to review these policies and get their feedback to ensure that they were engaged in this work as well. And then as well, as is typical in our policy work, we vetted our drafts and revisions with our partners at Drummond Woodsum to ensure that we were able to both advance our kind of strategic interests while remaining compliant with any state or federal legislation. So they had our support, or they provided their support with that feedback, and any of their recommendations are also incorporated in the drafts you see in front of you. So just a word around kind of what you have in terms of the packet this evening. Given kind of the extensive work that's been underway here, we provided kind of a summary table, and Jake will speak to each of the policies in just a moment, that reflects kind of the substantive changes that move from the current versions to the proposed new versions. We had many rounds of drafts and made our typical kind of redlining process somewhat unmanageable for us to track and follow over time. So that's why you have those versions with us in front of you today in terms of how it was presented. That was part of our discussion with the policy committee. But recognize that there, in many cases, particularly for kind of our two foundational policies, policy JIC, which is the Student Code of Conduct, as well as policy JK, which historically was the Student Discipline Policy, is proposed to be renamed as the Behavioral Interventions and Supports Policy. There's significant substantive changes there that really reflect almost a total rewrite. So just wanted to provide that context in terms of the materials you have available for your consideration. So Jake, I'll keep moving us forward. Oops, excuse me. If you want to step in and talk us through some of the changes that are in the policies.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for doing the kind of quick description of the process, which was, as you alluded to, long, and it had many iterations. So the first slide here highlights two policies that kind of serve as keystones for the whole suite of policies. JIC, you could call it the Student Code of Conduct, and JK is really about the adult side of things. And these two policies, prior to revision, they sort of read as official notice to families and students that if they misbehave, they can have consequences. And the updates really make them more comprehensive, update their tone, and talk about more holistically about what the district believes needs to be done to maintain safe, nurturing, participatory, productive learning environments. So in JIC, there's an updated tone in the preamble to kind of reflect that, as well as to incorporate Portland Public Schools' expressed core values, which are, if you don't remember, high expectations, creativity, innovation, individuality, community, and courage. This policy used to be very long. It used to have a summary of every discipline policy appended to it. So that's been removed, and those are captured in references. The second policy, JK Student Discipline, we're proposing that it be retitled to Behavioral Interventions and Supports to align to the district philosophy around PBIS, as well as to present this in a different light, that it's not just a list of consequences, it's a list of things that the district leaders and teachers can implement to support expected behaviors and positive communities. Again, some tonal changes, reference to the district's core values, and an extended section providing examples of what kind of things you might have in a system of tiered interventions and supports beyond simple punitive consequences. There is a new article that talks about, it provides for monitoring, intervening in disciplinary inequities at the building level, at the district level, and at the board level. So there's a provision for kind of a cascade of review and reporting that gets all the way up to the board level on an annual basis.
Can I ask, I don't know, can we have a right to ask a question before to move forward, or we just need to ask a question after the presentation? I just want to make sure, because there's a lot of policy here. And I have a question with JK.
It's a workshop. I think it would be, if it's fine with the chair, I think it makes sense for you to pause at, the different policies and just, go ahead and ask.
Okay, sure. Okay, I will. Thank you.
Ms. Bondo, please do go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just something that I don't want to miss is I try to understand why we have to have the review annually to the board why we need to wait 1 full year to have that, because that's a key major on the discipline. So is not any way something can be maybe twice a year just to have I try to understand why the report should be annually.
So let me tackle that. I think the data is updated daily. So it is not something that we only, look at once a year. I think the idea is that the board is an oversight body that is interested in the policy level. You're not going to do anything to change what happened to, a specific individual or, data at the school level. So I think the idea is for the board to exercise its oversight role, not to actually be an intervener.
Okay.
So I think that that's the thinking behind that.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. It makes sense. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
There's, of course, nothing in the policy to preclude the board from taking up the matter with greater frequency if it so desires.
All right.
Okay. So I'll just speak briefly on the suspension policy, which I think is one of the most important policies in this suite. In an earlier slide, Assistant Superintendent Townsend shared suspension disparity data, and that's pretty common around the country. And part of the reason for that is that suspensions are pretty consistently tracked, and it's easy data to mine. It's not the only measure of disciplinary disparities, but it's pretty important, and it's also an extreme measure to exclude a student from the learning environment. So in the proposed revisions to the suspension policy, there's some clear definitions of what constitutes suspension. There's provision to make sure that language access is considered in due process. There's additional guidance on partnering constructively with families rather than just informing them of a suspension. And finally, and most importantly, perhaps, there are parameters added that are intended to limit suspension as a tool, and when it is used, to make its implementation more constructive for a student. I'll add parenthetically here that the policy committee has an unfinished conversation about whether it was proposed to prohibit suspension at the elementary level. That conversation didn't get all the way to a resolution, in part because we didn't have time to vet it with elementary leaders, but that's something that could come up in future reviews, for instance, on the annual review of discipline disparities. So I'll pause there and ask for questions about the suspension policy, because I think it is an important one.
Mr. Rodriguez's hand is up, I see.
Mr. Rodriguez?
Thank you. So I wanted to acknowledge I brought up the suggestion that we consider the elementary school, I brought up the suggestion that we have a policy that we not have elementary school suspensions. I appreciate that we would want to have a substantive conversation around that, and so we thought that given the amount of work that the committee has right now, that wouldn't be the right time. But I wanted to, I was thinking when would be the right time to ask this question. A couple of weeks ago, I was testifying in favor of LD 474. It's an act regarding discipline for Maine's youngest students. And that proposed bill is in essence, is proposing exactly what I just suggested we enact as a policy. But during the discussion, there was a workshop after the public hearing. So during the discussion, however, on the situation in which a student that is disruptive in the classroom and cannot return to the classroom, and also nothing, I guess, else can be done with the student, and then the family is called to come get the student, and the student then leaves home, and how that is then documented as a suspension. Is that accurate, what I just described? I want to pause there.
You're asking if in that scenario we would document it as a suspension?
Yes.
We should, yeah.
Okay. So in a similar situation, let's say that the reason that the child cannot return to the classroom, it's not because it would be disruptive to the classroom, but rather because the child's social emotional well-being does not allow them to return to the classroom, right? So it's not the classroom's disruption, but the child's. And then same thing, the best situation is for the parents to come pick up that kid. Is that recorded as a suspension?
I guess, and Jake, weigh in on this.
Is what I'm.
We're prohibiting the students from returning to the classroom, right? For whatever reason, then it would be required to be documented as a suspension. So even if,
I see.
Yeah, there could be different variations of that scenario you're painting.
No, absolutely, and I don't mean to narrow it down to those two. I'm just yeah.
But just to clarify, a student could have a medically excused absence for like psychiatric treatment, or which would not be a suspension.
Would not be a suspension. That's the ultimate. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. And again, it was something that question that because of the discussion that would happen at the legislature workshop, I thought we'd throw it in here. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question as well, and just with respect to, and I apologize if I missed this because I was having trouble with my connectivity for a moment there. But the other note that's in the suspension of students policy revision about whether about the conversation within the policy committee to make the limitation of the number of days a student could be suspended a cumulative figure for the year. Can you speak more to where that landed and what you see as next steps there? It seems like ideally we wouldn't leave issues unresolved, that we would as a board make a decision now based on what we think is the best way to go. So I'd be interested to hear more about that.
Okay, in full candor, I don't remember where we landed on that or how we proceeded in our policy committee conversations.
I don't remember specifically either, but I think it is fair to say that we did not limit the number of days that a student can be suspended in the aggregate. So while there is a limitation to how many days a student can be suspended, for any one event, we did not say that there's a maximum of 10 or 15 or 50 days that a student can be suspended. So I don't recall the discussion, but I know what the outcome was.
I mean, the discussion where we landed in deciding not to limit it was around having a level of review for suspensions for greater than 5 days, so that there was some oversight and just 10-day suspensions were not being, previously those were fully within principal discretion.
But isn't this a question of whether a student is suspended for 10 days and then again for 10 days and then again for 10 days? And it seems like I might hear the superintendent say that a limitation at this point we think might be arbitrary, or we might not, there might not be clarity around what the maximum number of days should be. Am I hearing that right? Or?
But I think what, and Aaron, I think this is what you said, right? That any time that it's over a certain number of days, it gets reviewed at the district level. So that would be by you, right? So that, there is no sort of, people being suspended 5 days and then 10 days and then 5 days and then 10 days without somebody knowing it.
I don't see that in the policy revision. Is that something you're recalling that we were going to put in the revision? Superintendent Batana?
I was following Aaron's lead.
Well, that was, my understanding of where that conversation, we didn't want to arbitrarily, set a limit. And again, just as a reminder for everybody that there is a limit for students who, students who have disabilities where that is prescribed. They may not be suspended for more than 10 days. So this is in respect to student general education students. And so it was, in that, as opposed to having that specific limitation, it was intended to have that level of oversight so that it was being monitored for each, in all of those instances.
Just looking back at the policy, I don't see that the policy revision. I don't see that language either. So it may be something we want to come back to at second read. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I was just noticing that whenever we've seen the discipline, or rather the out-of-school suspension numbers, we've never seen length of suspension data. Would it be possible to when we report to the board to see that, and of course desegregate it so we see the length of suspension per racial group?
Yep.
Yeah, we can do that. So it can provide that data as well, so that get a sense of impact of like loss of instructional time, right? Which totally makes sense. The suspension rate is often calculated based on incidents, not necessarily duration. So that's often why that's the metric that's used, is the number of incidents. But we can add that to the reporting.
Yeah, and I just point out that suspensions are, relatively rare in the landscape of school discipline in Portland. And so when you start parsing out the data, you get to really small ends. But it's worth looking at because it's an indicator of bigger trends within behavior management. Yeah.
Ms. Bando.
Yes, thank you. I just want to emphasize for the length of suspension. So that's one of the questions that I was looking to get some answer. And also for how we define the suspension, are we going to have details, maybe a little more deep on the JKD for different elements of the suspension for parents to understand why those are the suspension elements, then like a behavior and some of the actions then the school has to take to decide, then does a suspension must needed for a student to be removed from the classroom. Are we going to have more details on those on each those are specific policies than we define on the suspension?
In the revision that's before you today, there is an initial section that defines the two kinds of suspension, in school and out of school. Okay. There's a second section called application, which attempts to delineate when it is appropriate and when it is not appropriate to suspend, to kind of limit. And then there's a procedure section that reiterates some of that and provides for some due process as well. However, if there's a piece of that needs expanding, we could certainly look at that.
Yes, because we really need to especially for parents, we really need to have a more simple language for them to understand what was really coming to the suspension from the student. So that means reduce the complexity of the language for a better understanding for parents, I think is a must. And one more on the art parameters. I was just looking on when we try to limit suspension, then what I really want to see happening, do we have any academic support coming after that, or is just we try to limit the suspension, but when the student is being suspended, what kind of academic support the student may have a backup after that?
Yeah. So the final two paragraphs address the obligation of the school to address that and to collaborate with the family on that.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
In Board Member Bondo, just briefly to the communication with families, there's a, outside of the policy work that we've begun with our IT team around, how we provide, simple, clear written documentation for families about incidents of suspension and the rationale. So it's not necessarily doesn't have a place in the policy, but in terms of our systems, in terms of communication, that's a piece of work that, we'd begun a conversation just prior to the pandemic. Some of this has, that kind of system work has had a little bit of a back burner during the pandemic, but that'll be a piece that we continue to move forward. So there's some simple, clear templates when those instances, when it does have to be used, we're able to communicate effectively.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Ms. Bondo, I put in the chat the current version of the revised discipline suspension policy, JKD.
Okay. Thank you. I saw it. Thank you.
All right, Jake, I think we might be ready for you to continue moving us forward through these policies.
So JICK is the bullying and cyberbullying policy. The revisions to that policy were not as substantive. There was some new introductory material to kind of align it with the tone of the other policies, and also edits throughout to align it with the new harassment policy, ACAA. So just to kind of piggyback on the long community work that went into that policy and to commute it into this policy for consistency.
And why don't you also speak to JICK-E2? I think do those.
So just really briefly, there was a board mandated bullying investigation form that's redundant to state mandated reporting in Infinite Campus that we need to do. And I think partly because of that redundancy, it wasn't getting done with fidelity. And so we're proposing to eliminate that board mandated form and instead only report in one place, which also reports to the state. And which is an instrument that building administrators and their administrative assistants are used to using on a daily basis. Okay. Okay. There's a policy regarding weapons, violence, and school safety. We clarified some of the definitions, including defining a firearm. Most importantly, this policy was revised to be consistent with the Virginia protocol, which is the threat assessment protocol that the district is using. I think that's the old name. I think there's a new name for it. But this threat protocol is kind of a post-Columbine era response to a kind of overreactive responses to perceived safety issues. It's kind of akin to the debate in our criminal justice system about mandatory sentences. So this threat assessment protocol helps administrators in a team, including a social worker and other professionals, to really get clear about the nature and the level of a threat, and to tailor an appropriate response that includes discipline as necessary, but also includes therapeutic responses as appropriate.
Mr. Burke.
Thank you. Is that team one of the instances where law enforcement remains involved?
So that protocol has only in certain situations is it recommending contacting law enforcement, but law enforcement is not part of the threat assessment team.
Thanks.
There is statutorily, separate from the threat assessment protocol, but just to address it statutorily, there is a requirement that in this specific instance of a defined firearm possession, that we have a statutory obligation to report that to law enforcement. But below that, as Dr. Giesman said, the threat assessment protocol doesn't necessarily prescribe that.
policy JKE expulsion is we almost never expel a student. I think Javier or Superintendent Patana can recall one expulsion in his tenure at Portland Public Schools. So the substantive edit in the expulsion policy was really to clearly posit expulsion as an intervention of very last resort, which it appears to be in practice in this district, but this is codifying that. And JKER is the procedures, sort of the due process procedures in the event of an expulsion. And we just increased kind of the protections for students and their families, requiring translation and interpretation as needed. And there's a provision for consideration of possible role of bias with sort of an impartial observer.
Thank you so much, Jake. I see Ms. Bondo has her hand up. Ms. Bondo?
Yes, thank you. I just needed to, because I had a lot of questions, I remember back then with a lot of community parents been asking about the fear they had with the multiple suspension can lead to the experts. So, I mean, are we going to expel a student because of multiple suspension, or you just related to actions, to any act or actions then that student can be is making and is really coming to the last resort to be expelled?
I mean, it is de facto very much the last resort. There's nothing in policy or in practice that suggests that, somebody who's, like after you're suspended, 5 times, we're going to expel you. That does not happen in practice. As Jake mentioned, there's been one instance in my 5 years where we've taken a student to an expulsion hearing, and, the folks that have been around longer than that don't remember the last time before that there was. So it is not a practice that is widely used in the district. So it definitely is not tied to sort of cumulative suspensions, and just is not used in practice. And what the policy revisions have done is have made it, sort of codifies that it's a last resort, and it also has built in a significant number of safeguards within the procedures part of the policy that Jake just described, to actually institutionalize the sort of the practice of having a impartial reviewer before the expulsion actually takes place, to ensure that there was no, sort of unintended implicit bias or things along those lines.
Okay.
I'd also add that expulsion is an act of the board, so it's not going to happen without an investigation, a board hearing, and a board vote, in addition to those other safeguards. So it's not something that an administrator would arbitrarily decide to do on their own accord.
Yeah, and I think the language too can be like Mr. Thompson just said, the communication with parents, and I think is the language can be more explicit, so they can have those practical aspects of cumulative suspension is not ending to the expel. So that means it's a process between those two policies. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bando. Mr. Rodriguez.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add, during the discussion at the policy committee, acknowledging that this is such a rare occurrence, the focus of our revisions were really just to make sure that when it does occur, that we're allowing that student every opportunity possible to be part of that process, such as, having the interpreters as needed, and making every effort to ensure that the family is taking part of hearings and meetings that have to take place, particularly when the board is included. I unfortunately was part of the one expulsion that the superintendent was part of, so I appreciated the rare occurrence of this being in place, and having a board member that happened to have been in one as we are reviewing this policy. So Ms. Thompson, I think, I'm sorry, my timeline is off, but I'm trying to see who else was here when we did that, when we had to go through that. But again, it's just something to note of the people that are going to be approving this revision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Ms. Bondo and I were also there. All right, are there further board questions? Mr. Rodriguez, do you have your hand up again? No, okay. Superintendent Townsend and Dr. Giesman, I'm not sure if you have more of a presentation. I just wanted to say,
Mr. Burke's hand is up.
Oh, sorry. Sure. Mr. Burke.
Yeah, sorry, snuck in there. I've been reading the policies and listening, and just wondering about holistically if folks involved feel like this addresses, how to say it, like white dominant culture and the how that just sets what is expected and how we're going to behave and what's in and what's out. I see lots of specific language in different places that are signals to me as such, and there's still something to me that I'm not sure as I read that. So just curious y'all's take.
I'll take a shot at it. I think, it's hard to say that it will, remedy, that it will be remedied by policy. But I do think that it was a comprehensive effort by a group of people who, had that lens as they engaged with the policies. And, I think, the first two policies that we walked through, the code of conduct and the student discipline policies are, there was a deliberate effort to sort of change the orientation in those policies from one that is, sort of an authoritarian, paternalistic institution to one that is, focused on, sort of teaching, what we're there to do, teaching, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, using language that is sort of the currency of our work around positive behavior interventions and supports. And so just, the name change in and of itself represents that. But, do I think that we've got it licked and it's never going to, that there's, no. And I think that that's also why, we have built in, the sort of, public review of the outcomes and things along those lines. So I think to the extent that we see that those outcomes, change, I think is the degree to which we can say that we've been successful. And if not, we need to, there's more work to be done.
I would add just two things. I mean, and again, I totally agree with the superintendent's, efforts in that direction. I'm sure not all the way there. I think one of the kind of clear efforts is the move, specifically in, what'll be the behavioral interventions, was kind of specifying expectations of the development of those standards in conjunction with students and families. So that's one of the moves that stands out to me, to move in that direction, right? That it's not just we decide the rules for you, but there's some expectation of some co-construction there around the norms. So that's one piece. And then I think, just as the superintendent said, the annual review, that language, does consider as well whether they're in reviewing the outcomes, are there particular policies or practice changes that need to be accompanied if we're not seeing the progress in terms of the outcomes that we'd like to see. So I think that's another safeguard that kind of we had envisioned in the writing of that, to be able to monitor our work over time.
Thank you. Mr. Rodriguez.
I'm not sure who Mr. Berg was asking the question to, but if at the very least, as chair of the committee, I wanted to share my thoughts. And as someone that had, obviously advocated that we took this work on. I think that part of what I'm hearing the superintendent and assistant superintendent say is that, the progress that we're making here is commendable. And what I've come to look at the policies as is a form of accountability for us. It's something that we fall back on, and so that's I think a clear change in direction is what we're seeing here. To your question, like, are we changing the culture of public schools through these policies? Probably not through the policies on their own, but what we've created. I remember when I first started to really forcibly bring up the suspension data discrepancies. And the one thing that became obvious was that most folks were just simply not aware of it. No one had seen it. No one, and immediately when presented, the discussions changed. So I would say that we are now a significantly further step ahead in levels of awareness as a district, and that is immensely valuable. And again, changes in these policies then hold us accountable. So that 10 years from now, when I'm sitting in some other office and I'm going down my list of accomplishments, someone can call me out for whatever outcomes result of this policy. I'll be accountable for it. Okay, that's the way I'm looking at it.
I'll remember that, Mr. Rodriguez.
Oh, please do.
Ms. Thompson.
I will too.
No, I just want to ask, I think that what we may have missed, what the his and her in our policies, we've tried to deviate away from his and her. And so if we could just watch for that, because I see in JICIA, we have a his, her. And so we could just review those for that, because I think we were trying to get away from all of that. So thank you. That was the only comment I had.
Thank you. Yep.
Excellent. Well, I'll just note that I remember when we first got the review of these policies back, and just thinking through how much these policies have changed. And I hear that we're not done, and we should never be done, because we should be constantly, continually reevaluating. But these policies are transformed, and they articulate our values in a way that before, I think they were up against the type of district we are trying to be. So I just want to commend Jake and Aaron and Roberto and everyone, the superintendent, everyone who's been involved, all the stakeholders, and I just want to appreciate. I read through them again this morning after not reading them for some time, and I was kind of astounded, just and in a wonderful way, just in terms of how far the policies have come and what they now represent in terms of the values that they embody. So thank you so much, everyone who's worked so hard on this and over a very long period of time.
Interject just to also thank Grace Valenzuela, who personally and through all the people she's marshaled has had a big impact on this suite of policies.
So Aaron and Jake, did you have anything to close this section out?
No, I mean, I think, there are a couple of, pieces of follow-up that we'll do and bring forward back for the second read. And so we can highlight those. So appreciate this discussion and the chance to bring this forward and look forward to this work ongoing with you all.
Excellent.
Can I just add to that first my appreciation to Aaron and Jake, and then just to board members, if you have other changes or concerns between now and the next meeting, please, the sooner you can get those to us. So if there are any changes to the policies, we can make those and, bring them forward or note them for your discussion when we're actually dealing with the policies. It's just so much better process for us than not having people introduce an amendment to the policy in the heat of the passage. So, we would rather be deliberative and deliberate about not advancing a policy if it's not ready, if somebody has serious concerns. So just, between now and, as soon as possible prior to the next meeting, if you could raise those concerns so that we're not trying to, that's not when we're doing our best policy work.
And if I could just note that the summary document that Jake and Aaron have compiled is extremely helpful and accessible in that it links the old policy and the new policy. And so it's very easy to actually go through each of the policies, and and there's a summary similar to what Jake went through today in terms of the major changes. And just thank you so much for providing that summary document, because when there's so many policies to consider, it's a really helpful, I'll say, cheat sheet, but it's a lot of, it's a lot to take in. And so to help us organize it, it's very helpful. And so please, I want to really encourage board members to, if you haven't had the time or after tonight's discussion, if you want to go back again to really read those policies, and as the superintendent suggested, to raise questions or concerns, flag any issues that you see so we can give them due diligence before we vote on them. And I think barring any kind of red flags, the idea would be to vote on them at our next meeting on the 18th. Is that right, Mr. Superintendent?
That's correct. And can I just also say, and this may preempt her raised hand, I know that Board Member Thompson asked us to provide the red line version of the policy, so we will do that. And that way you've got, the actual, it's very hard to follow. Some of these policies are very significantly different from what they were before. And so that's why we chose not to do that. But if that's something that people feel they need to see, I think we'll provide that so that you can see, the magnitude. And some of them are not that different. So I think that you'll see both.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, I think that brings us to the conclusion of this workshop. Thank you so much, everyone.